If you were a character from a story, you picked being a Skybax writer from Dinotopia. Why did you pick that?
I think just because it's like something I just remember from a pretty young age of just seeing that and just like it setting my imagination on fire. Just like the way the paintings look in the book is like so beautiful and majestic, and I'm just like, oh, I want to do that. And also the uniforms look cool, and then they have the whole part in the in sort of the later part of the story, like you follow. I think like Will is the boy's name.
Will Dennison?
Yeah, who goes to the school out in the Canyon City to become a Skybax writer. And there's like those paintings and vistas, and just like the coolest things.
Totally. I dreamed just staring at those books and reading them, and then the book where they go underground into that crystal city and stuff. It's like that had mega Disney Atlantis vibes.
Yes. No, I made that connection like way later on, because I didn't see the movie until a few years later. Then I'm like, this is just Atlantis with dinosaurs.
Which is better. Did you know they originally had space whales in their concept art and they didn't roll with it?
I did not know that. That's pretty great.
Yeah, that would have... Anyhow, welcome everybody to Legend Makers. It's the first episode of our show for LegendFiction.com. Today we are joined by Mary Jessica Woods. Welcome, Mary. Good to have you with us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Today we're chatting about Mary's book. It's just recently been published through Chrism Press, Markmaker. It's a sci-fi novel, so excited to chat about that. Mary Jessica Woods is a Byzantine Catholic, a sci-fi fantasy author who loves beauty, truth, and adventure in all their forms. We're going to get to her origin story in just a second. For those who aren't familiar with what Legend Fiction is, it's a creative community for modern Catholic and Orthodox authors. This show, Legend Makers, it's all about interviews, convos, and community news about this community. We're going to talk creed, craft, and co-creation rooted in grit, grace, gods, and dragons when we can fit them in. Let's inspire your faith and your fiction. Okay, Mary, what is your origin story? How did you fall in love with writing?
So I've pretty much been storytelling as long as I can remember. Just grew up an avid reader, especially of sort of things in the fantasy or like fantastic genre. So my teenage years, I kept writing. I kind of decided from a pretty early age that like I wanted to be an author, like a fiction writer. So just kind of pursued that in a pretty serious way from a fairly young age. Like I would submit to publications. I don't know if you're familiar with Stone Soup magazine.
No, I've not heard of them.
I'm pretty sure they're still going, but they're a magazine that specifically publishes like fiction, poetry, and artwork by children, like I think it's like 8 to 13 years old, and you have to be in the age range to submit.
Yeah.
But they like pick out the best stuff that they get. So it's really high quality, and they pay you too.
Well, that's cool.
So yeah, so I got a few things in Stone Soup when I was that age. And yeah, I just kept pursuing it. I don't know where you want this origin story to cut off, but or where it
no,
segues
that's fine.
to the next
What
question.
was one of the first stories you remember writing that that really got things going for you?
I think probably the first one that really took off, that kind of made me realize that I wanted to be a writer, was a novel. It's not actually novel length. I thought it was at the time, but I forget how many words it was. But it was like a sort of novella length manuscript, a fantasy story. Basically, I guess it would fall in the genre of portal fantasy, technically. Like the main character's like a 12-year-old girl who was basically me. finding like a magic treehouse that transports her to a fantasy world. And I actually had like, that was where a lot of the Dinotopia stuff came in. Like in that world, there were these giant birds that you could ride on, and so that was epic. But like that was the first long story, like longer than a short story, that I finished and like typed up. And I'm like, oh wow, that wasn't so hard. I could do this again. Of course, then it took like 9 years until I finished another novel-length story. So it is harder than it, seemed at first. But
Right. Well, so tell us about your novel and the journey for writing that. First, what's the quick overview for Markmaker?
So Markmaker is a story set entirely in this alien society called the Noxine. And their whole culture revolves around these ceremonial tattoos. So like their legal system and like social status and even their religion is bound up in these tattoos. So of course in a culture like this, the tattoo artists are very important figures. And they swear an oath to tell the truth. Like their marks always have to be truthful because they're so central to everything. So the main character of Markmaker is one of these tattoo artists for a very prestigious clan. And he finds out, or he's basically coerced into giving a mark of exile, which is like one of the worst punishments that they have. He's forced to give a mark of exile to a man that he believes is innocent. So then he's sort of forced into this, moral dilemma of like, I think I gave a false mark. I think I broke my oath, but he's, too afraid to tell anyone at first, and not really sure what to do about this. So then from there, it just sort of, that's what sparks the conflict, and then from there it's kind of goes through, like he sort of starts like delving deeper into the sort of shady underside of what's really going on in this society, sort of uncovering more of this corruption and like people who have been cast aside unjustly. And has to decide what he's going to do about that.
I love the first couple of chapters that I read. Like I love your style. The style is gripping. I love the main character. He pulled me right in, and especially those moments where he quits his day job and he heads basically out into the slums to use his craft in a way that he knows is like riding the line of what's acceptable in his culture. But
it's definitely over the line of what's acceptable.
Okay, yeah. I was trying not to say too much, but over the line. Yeah. But because he knows he's doing something that is good, something that is just, and I immediately liked him as a character. So kudos for creating a world and then using your story elements to like also give us a character that we can root for. So why did you pick an all-alien culture? What did that give you in telling a story? What was the edge that you wanted from that?
Well, I think sort of the initial spark of the story, this is sort of the other backstory of the novel, which we can get into later if you want, but that the world came from this role-playing game that I was in college. So I was actually not the original creator of this alien race, but so I already knew them as like, oh, they're these aliens who have all these tattoos. And then I like stopped to think about it at some point, and I'm like, wow, what would it be like to live in a culture like that? Like, really, what would it be like? And the sort of the constant, like just living in a culture where everything significant about your life is just out there for people to see, whether it's something that is honorable or something that's shameful. Um, it's just like people expect to basically, people are like judging you all the time.
Yeah.
Um,
Do you see corollaries between that and our world today? Like, isn't First World West with social media and such? It feels very similar.
Yeah, no, there are definitely parallels. I think that was one of the interesting things about it, was that it allowed me to dig into some of these themes that are really relevant to our lives, but in sort of like a slightly foreign way.
Creative way.
Looking at it a bit of a, just like removing yourself from the context that you're used to and sort of highlighting something in a different context. That was kind of what initially piqued my interest for this story idea.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what sci-fi and fantasy is, ultimately about, is taking an idea, but if you were to tell it in this world, we would bring all of our preconceptions and stuff we're comfortable with. But you put it in an alien culture, and all of a sudden, I have no idea what comes next. And so then you give me an idea, and I'm like, oh, wow. It's like, oh, yeah, that's social media. Well, loosely.
Yeah.
What was the... So you're published through Chrism Press. What was the... Why did you opt for traditional versus self-publishing? What was that part of the journey like?
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting story because it came about through, I don't know, just really a lot of blessings, sort of being in the right place at the right time. So even before I sort of was with Chrism Press, I'd sort of been wanting to pursue the traditional route, partly just because, like, obviously there are many, self-published authors now who do really high-quality work, but it is a lot of work to do all by yourself.
Right.
So I kind of wanted to go the traditional route just to have, like, a team
Sure.
of people working with you. But Chrism Press, specifically, how that came about with my book was really interesting because it actually came about because I met one of the editors, Karen Yulo, at the Catholic Writers Guild conference back in summer of 2019. I've been a member of the Catholic Writers Guild for several years, so I'd gone to the summer conference that year, and I met Karen there. She gave a really cool presentation about, like, metaphysics and fiction or something awesome.
Nice.
Just like, wow, you're a super cool person. And I, like, wish I could have you as a critique partner or something. And at the time, Chrism didn't even exist. But while I was at that conference, I learned about an online critique group that the Catholic Writers Guild had specifically for sci-fi and fantasy. So I joined that group, and Karen Yulo was also in that group. So then, like, after I'd been in that group for about a year, and I'd been working on this novel that would become Markmaker, I'd started posting chapters for the group to critique. And so Karen had read the first couple of them. And at the same time that I was starting to post stuff, she and her colleagues were in the process of founding Chrism Press. This was like the summer of 2020. So she actually approached me and said, hey, these first few chapters I've read are really good. Would you consider submitting this manuscript to our brand new publishing company? And I was like, yes. So yeah, I kind of got a little bit of a head start on the sort of the querying process. I did have to go through the whole, submission process, like write up a book proposal with all the elements of that, and then, submit the full manuscript, and then, wait for it to be accepted and figure out the contract and everything. So, but yeah, it was just like a lot of really good connections that I happened to make. So I feel very blessed that all of that happened. And also that, like, the people at Chrism are really on board with, like, we're on the same wavelength when it comes to like the kinds of stories that Catholics can tell.
Can we talk more about that? Yeah, let's talk more about that, because that's something I have so enjoyed chatting with both Karen and Rhonda, and was it Eleanor is another member, and then yourself.
Eleanor is one of the other authors, Eleanor Nicholson.
Yeah, and there's like Maya in there, and they're all on that same wavelength, and I love just chatting with them and just inviting them onto the show,
write,
because
like, such different. We all write different books.
Exactly,
they're
so also different. There's fantasy, there's whatever. So what is that?
Yeah.
That I love the turn of phrase they use is faith-inspired fiction, which I think is perfect, because it's got a good focus for where things should go. Do you hear that thunder? Is that thunder in your end?
Yes, that's over here. We've got a storm rolling in.
Okay, just making sure.
I hope it doesn't knock out the power. That would be annoying.
Let me see where I was going with that.
Faith-inspired fiction.
I love the turn of phrase that they use. I think is so cool. Faith-inspired fiction, because it puts the stress on the right word, which is what you want when you're dealing with a specific craft. So to your mind and your understanding, what is it that you have loved about the attitude that Chrism has, and why this is something that's important?
I think I sort of have this vision about fiction that's both very broad and very deep. It's sort of broad in the sense that it can encompass, basically all genres that are good and true and beautiful. Everything from like historical and romance to contemporary and literary, to like horror, to sci-fi fantasy. Just sort of like taking in all of creation in a sense, like in that very like Catholic universal sense.
Yeah.
But also very deep in like sort of a depth with just like the morals and truths and symbols that are shining through these very different kinds of stories. They're all sort of drawing from the same wellspring, even if it can take many different forms. So yeah, because I love that, because there are always like little factions even within something as small as the Catholic fiction world, about like what can really be classified as Catholic fiction, or what kind of stories people of faith are allowed to write. And yeah, so I just love how it's so broad, but like also so grounded in the truth. Yeah, that's.
What do you think about that phrase? What creators are allowed to write? What do you think about that?
I have opinions. Let's see.
Well, maybe I should give you a little.
How to phrase this? Yeah, I might have to think about.
Let me create a little foundation for kind of how.
Okay.
I have been grappling with this same sort of thing as well, probably as long as you have. Like, where are we in terms of like there is a Catholic spectrum of activity that's going on, and I'm trying to find an honest, but what also feels to me like an accurate assessment of the different kinds of tribes that are out there within the Catholic fiction sort of arena. It's the wrong word.
Yeah.
Landscape, I should say.
Yeah.
So far I've divided it into like 4. You have the literati, and they are deeply focused on creating works of literature, works of art. So that's the literati. Then there's the imprimatur, and they're a group that they care very much about like getting an imprimatur on their fiction, on their work. It's like every T must be crossed, every I dotted, and something like that. There's the creati. All they care about is just creating. They really don't care about their faith. It's just the act of creating whatever. Faith is not that important. And the last kind is the populati, which is Catholic fiction that is created for like a mass audience, for general people, for the pew sitter, for the non-affiliated Christian anymore, for just the general sort of people. Legend fiction, we go after the populati. We're not creati because our faith is really important to us, but we're not imprimati in that it's like so important that it sort of occludes the demands of great fiction and great storytelling. And then I forget the last one already, whatever, but someone can rewind and listen. Point being that the world that we live in today has themes and mega fandoms and tropes and so on that should also feed back into the stories that we tell, so that we create resonance with the average reader who probably is not looking to their Catholic bookstore for interesting fiction. So we want to create stuff that's going to appeal to not the widest possible audience, because that's not really fair, but to audiences outside of our, air quotes, tribe. So maybe that's some foundation. That's where how I'm approaching it. I'm curious what you think and maybe where you might put yourself.
Yeah, I think I would probably just working within those divisions that you just laid out. I'm probably most in the populati. Just wanting to write like good, enjoyable stories that pretty much anyone can enjoy. But I do also care a lot about the craft, and a lot about the faith, but in a way that's sort of like I don't need to put Catholicism explicitly into my stories, but to have sort of the underlying moral framework of my worldview, which is inevitable. Every author's worldview is going to come out in their work, whether it's explicitly talked about or not. So I wrote my story about tattooed ancestor worshipping aliens, and yes, I think it is a Catholic book, but not in the way that some people would think. So
no, it's I think that's exactly. I mean, this is something that it's been growing in me as watching the community and doing what we've been doing for the last year or so, encouraging people, stop trying to put Catholic, like overt Catholic stuff in your stories. Just don't do it.
Unless there's a good reason for it to be there.
And exactly, you have a very clear reason, because what can then happen is it becomes a shorthand for you, a shorthand for how you approach your character. More importantly, the idea that you're putting in there, you sort of get what that is, and so you sort of drop that in. Whereas if you're not allowed to even use those labels or use those names, or even better, transpose the whole thing into an alien galaxy where tattoos are the main means of communication, that then forces you to be more creative and to rethink what it is you actually say you believe and what what's happening. And that's kind of the point of fiction, is to get us to reframe and rethink things. So I want to ask about world building and backstory. How did you handle that for something like this? How much world building did you go into? Not much at all. What was your approach?
Yeah, so again, this was really fun, actually, because, as I mentioned earlier, the whole world that the story is set in was created by a friend of mine. We were classmates in college. And he, created this sci-fi world for a role-playing game that he came up with. And I was one of the players in that game. So, and then I loved the world so much that I just basically started writing fan fiction. And then one of the fan fiction pieces turned into a novel, so that happened.
So there you go. Play games, people. Games is life.
Exactly. But what ended up happening, it was really great because in a lot of ways, I'd actually never written sci-fi before this. And a big reason for that was because the world building intimidated me. I'm a very story-focused, character-focused sort of writer. Not that I dislike world building, but it's just not my go-to thing. It's a little, it could be a little bit of a chore. So, world building for a sci-fi universe was always just really intimidating, even though I love the genre. But when I had sort of this world to play around in, like this huge sandbox. And there were different sort of elements and like history of the world that were already in place that I could just, take from this and that, and then, start fleshing things out on my own.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the big picture pieces, like, the Noxian race and their tattoo culture and the fact that they live on these big generation ships and their war that's going on with the humans, which is very much a backstory, like a background element in the book, but like all of these big world building elements were already in place when I started writing the story. But I did definitely have to, because, it was like, when I started writing the book, it was just for me and my friends. And so it was, in some sense, I didn't have to do a lot of world building because they already knew the context.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't have to explain a lot of things to them that a new reader coming in would need explanations.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely did that was one of the big things I had to do in revision, was kind of go through and take a closer look at things. I'm like, okay, someone who's never experienced this sci-fi world before, what information are they going to need? Like, what visuals and sort of cultural context am I going to need to give them to make everything actually coherent? So I had a lot to work with in the first draft, but a lot of the sort of the more vivid and specific world building details came together in the revision.
In a moment, I want to ask you what the writing process was like and how you stayed organized and maybe what are the tools you used and how you got in the zone and so on. But first, in talking about sci-fi, what are some of your inspirations, some fandoms that you've enjoyed following, and in particular, what are the ones that directly influenced this story?
This is always a really hard question because I can like name a lot of influences, but they're not obvious influences.
Okay.
So I can't say, oh yeah, it's like a combination of this thing and this thing. But I mean, sort of big picture influences. And again, sort of going back to the classics like Lewis and Tolkien, and actually, again, this is like not an obvious influence, but I've always loved stories that sort of are like on the borderline between sci-fi and fantasy. So that's kind of why I like things like Dinotopia, which is like fantasy dinosaurs, but it's also sort of this like this Jules Verne-esque sort of like old-fashioned sci-fi.
Right.
And I don't know, that's just like a really appealing combination to me. And then other influences, I would say a big one is Orson Scott Card. Especially, I haven't read all of his books, he has many. But like the main well-known ones, the Ender's Game and sort of the books surrounding those. His stuff is really interesting because he's very character-focused. And his stories almost always have a very strong like moral theme or question that they're circling around, but they're also sci-fi. They're set on space stations or, distant planets, or you're dealing with alien races who, are totally different from humanity, and, trying to understand each other and the crazy things that happen when when you try to do that. So Orson Scott Card, I think, is a big one. And then I'm gonna name this one. This is not sci-fi, but it's one of my favorite books ever. Watership Down.
Oh, okay.
Which is, I don't know if you've read it.
I don't think I've actually. If I did, it was 15 years ago, and I don't remember it very well. Okay. Why Watership Down, though?
Yeah. So for people who may not be familiar with it, it's a fantasy, but the premise is kind of like it's the society of wild rabbits. Like if wild rabbits were sentient and had like a culture and a society, but they were still very much like they live like actual rabbits do. What would their lives be like? And so it's like this story about animals, but it's actually terrifying.
Yeah. Okay.
And you know, it's pretty intense. But one of the things that I love about it is that there's this whole sort of rich history and culture that they have that's very intertwined with, you know, how rabbits actually live their lives in the wild and the things that they have to deal with. So there's like this very rich, like they have this sort of mythology, and they tell all these stories about like the deities that they believe in and sort of like the legendary figures, that they sort of like pass these stories down through generations. So it's like it's one of the most compelling depictions I've ever seen of a fictional religion.
Okay.
That you actually take seriously within the context of the story.
Wow.
It doesn't feel like, you know, oftentimes in sort of like contemporary fantasy books there might be like a system of deities or gods, but at least in many of the books that I've read, it rings a little false. It rings a little hollow. You don't really get a sense of real, like the numinous. But in Watership Down you do, which is fascinating because they're rabbits.
They're rabbits. The closest I've read along those lines was a novel called A Rustle in the Grass, and it was about ants and empires of ants, and it was I remember there just being like there's red ants very much felt like the Roman Empire, and then there's these smaller black ants or sugar ants or something, and they had their heroes, their mythology, and then there's the one ant who all of a sudden starts breaking out with their visions of the fall or the collapse of things.
Yeah.
And
so
and it was, I remember it just enchanted me as a kid. One, because I love micro worlds. I love those kinds of things. And it was it was compellingly told. And I reread it years later, and I wasn't as enamored of it. But that sense of creating a mythology or giving an actual, you know, fantasy world building to things like that. Anyhow, that fascinates me too. So you took some of that energy and then you applied it to Markmaker.
Yeah, I think so. Like very different context, but sort of a little bit of the same vibe. I hope anyway.
Yeah, very cool. Well, tell us about your writing process. How do you get in the zone? What kind of tools do you use? How long did it take you to go through the revisions?
Yeah, so the whole process from like initial story idea to published novel in 2 weeks from now. 3 years, like 3 years exactly, actually.
Okay.
Which is actually a pretty fast turnaround, I've been told, for a first novel.
Okay.
I think it helped that I had a lot of the world building done for me before I started writing this story. But it was a really interesting process for me because I actually did some new things with this book that I hadn't really done with previous projects. The main one being that for the first draft of Markmaker, I wrote entirely by hand.
Really? Okay.
Which wasn't something I had done since I was, like, I hadn't written a full story by hand since I was 10 years old. And I think I decided to do that because in, like, the 6 months or so before I started writing Markmaker, I'd really been in a rut creatively. And I was just in this pattern of like working on an idea and editing it over and over again and like outlining and brainstorming and then writing and then, you know, throwing it out. And I was just like, I need to do something different. This isn't working. So with this new idea, I, all I had basically was the concept of, like, alien tattoo artist in a society that revolves around tattoos, but he's broken his oath to tell the truth. I didn't know why. I didn't know his backstory. I didn't really know why he was breaking the law the way that he was. I didn't know yet what motivated him. It was just like, I'm going to follow this character and see what he does.
That is so cool. So what did handwriting teach you, like, about the process of all of that?
So basically what it allowed me to do, I am a very ingrained, like, self-editor.
Okay.
And so when I write on the computer, that delete button is just a constant temptation.
Okay.
I could spend, an hour working on one paragraph, if I'm not careful. Just trying, like, getting caught up in word choice and the prose and sort of trying to make everything perfect in my mind. But what writing it by hand allowed me to do was, it's much harder to delete things. If you want to delete something, you have to scratch it out, and then that's, like, messy and not nice looking. And I think there actually is something about the physical act of writing on a page that it just, like, engages a slightly different part of your brain, just, like, to allow things to flow with fewer inhibitions about what, is going onto the page.
Well, you handwrite slower than you type, I imagine.
Yes, yeah.
So that probably gives you a few extra seconds, but in brain time, that's a long time to actually think about where it's going and what could be said next.
Yeah, so basically what it allowed me to do was to just focus on really plot and character, and not worry about things like prose and word choice. Not that I wasn't trying to write well, but I was just like, oh, if I can't think of the perfect word right now, I'll just use a simple one, the first one that comes to mind, and I'll come back to it later. And the things that does to open up, like, making actual significant progress on a story and being able to finish something in a reasonable amount of time is incredible.
So how much of the whole novel did you write by hand? The entire first draft and then type it in?
Yeah, so I it's actually a nice process that I figured out. So the first draft was about 90,000 words. Filled up like 4 notebooks. But what I would do was I would write a scene by hand, like the very first raw draft. And then when I would finish that scene, I would go into my document on the computer and I would type it up. And that would be like my very first edit. But I would try not to change it too much. I would deliberately restrain myself from, getting too caught up in the details. But if there was something that, like, really wasn't working in the very first draft, or I, like, decided, oh, I actually had a better idea for this, then I could put that in there, and it would sort of, like, help me continue without, like, worrying about all the things that I wanted to go back and change. So I did that. I went back and forth. I would handwrite a scene, type it in, handwrite the next scene, type it in. And yeah, did that for the entire first draft.
Wow, that's impressive. How the first children's novel I ever wrote, I was 13 and I handwrote it by hand, and it was only 50 pages, but I have a sense of what that experience was like. I haven't done it as an adult. I don't think I'm too ADHD now to probably do that. I move way too fast. But so now that it's coming out and it's published and it's kind of done, are you thinking about other projects, other novels? And or is that still a ways away? Where's your mind now?
Well, right now my mind is very much in get the first book out there mode. But I have been having some ideas sort of simmering for a sequel because a lot of people have been asking for one.
Nice. So what has it been now that it's coming out and for almost the last 4 to 5 months or so. You've been letting people know that it's coming out, so you've been building the hype and so on. What are your thoughts or plans about kind of, how do I say, building an author brand around your book and maybe inviting people to continue staying in touch with you? Like, what have your thoughts been along those lines?
I mean, if you're basically just asking like what I've been doing in terms of like promotion efforts, I can go through the list.
Yeah, that and how people will
for.
stay in touch with you like after the novel is out. Like, is there like a, I don't know, like is there a fan group or something, or are there extra little tidbits available through the website, or I have no idea. Like, are there other ways that you stay in touch with your fan base as it grows?
Yeah, well, I mean, I sort of have the basic things. I have my author website. I have an author newsletter, which goes out monthly. So I stay in touch with people that way. And then I have my social media pages on Facebook and Instagram, and I've gotten a small but pretty like regular following at this point that I've been able to develop, which has been really fun. Just finding those people and seeing them like get excited about stuff and sort of find out what they're excited about, and just nerd out about sci-fi and fantasy. And yeah, I don't have anything sort of as a formal fan club per se, but I do have sort of projects that are sort of like running parallel to this. I mean, just to bring up one example, so my friend who created the original role-playing game, his name is Don and Scholl, and so he just recently started up like a social media platform for his game, which it's still in development. It's not, he hasn't like officially published it yet. He's like still working on the rule book and stuff. But he started to like put out, sort of lore and tidbits about the world and the different factions, and artwork. He's like a fantastic artist.
Wow.
So I think having that is going to be really fun. Just sort of having that partnership, and like continue this like creative collaboration, because we're working in the same world, just in different mediums.
Right.
Which is a lot of fun.
Have you had people who have like read your novel and then asked a question and you thought, oh, that could be a cool spin-off story or maybe a sequel from just other undeveloped aspects of the world?
Oh yeah. There are so many directions I could go. There are so many characters I want to follow and like tell their own stories.
Nice.
Yeah, so definitely a lot of places I can take it. I just need to actually have time to write again, which has been scarce recently.
Gotcha. Well, where can people find you online? How can they get in touch with you?
So there's my website, maryjessicawoods.com. That's sort of my home base. And then I'm also I have an author page on Facebook. Again, my name, Mary Jessica Woods, and that's my Instagram handle as well. So any of those places is a good way to keep in touch with me. And yeah, and then like the Chrism Press website as well is where you can find and purchase the book. So it's chrismpress.com.
Fantastic. And I'll put a link in the show notes in the description so people can score a copy as soon as it's available, or if you're watching this later, it'll probably be available then. So in just a second, I do want to wrap and ask you your 1-minute word of advice to Catholic authors everywhere. First, for those who are curious to learn more about Legend Fiction, it is, as I said at the beginning, the creative community for modern Catholic and Orthodox authors who are writing fictions, primarily science fiction and fantasy, but we're open to all kinds. Come and discover new worlds, support your favorite authors, and share your works in progress. It's a place where you can share stories for free or join our private community. Come check us out at legendfiction.com. If you had 1 minute, Mary, to share a word of encouragement to Catholic and Orthodox fiction lover writers anywhere, what would you want to say to them?
I think I would say write the story ideas that God gives you. Don't let sort of other people's expectations or maybe your own expectations sort of limit what you write about. There's no, I'm just speaking for myself. I kind of struggled for a long time with, can I write real Catholic fiction if I'm not writing literary fiction? Just dealing with is sci-fi and fantasy, can this be like profound and significant to people's lives? And the answer is absolutely yes. So yeah, just write the ideas that God gives you. They are gifts, and you should treat them as such. So